Muhammad received hundreds of revelations over the period of 22 years. And each time he turned to those around him, his companions, and he said, remember this. And he'd repeat those words. And they would work it until they had them embedded in their memory. But Muhammad was the only person who knew all of the revelations. All of the revelations besides Muhammad had been scattered in the memories of all those faithful. This one over here knew 3 or 4 of the revelations. This one had memorized a dozen of them. This one over here had a couple of them. But what made that important perhaps is the fact that one of those that that person had, he was the only one that had memorized that particular one. And so it was that when Muhammad died, the Quran was a shared oral experience, a memory experience of the entire ummah, the community. That was fine at the beginning, but then people began to die. That one that had memorized only the 2, but one very special one, was gone. And the Muslim community realized that that piece of the Quran was gone forever as a result of death. And so Uthman, the third of the rightly guided caliphs, the successors of Muhammad, decided to do something to prevent the Quran from being lost forever. So he instructed his secretary, Said, to gather everyone together. And Said had all of the people who remembered any of these revelation moments. And they'd line up and he'd say to them, tell me what you remember. And they would repeat back to him the revelations and he would write them down. Oh, a few of them had written things down on palm leaves or whatever. But most of them had them in their memory and they'd repeat and he'd write. And bit by bit he collected hundreds, maybe thousands of memories. Because this one remembered that, and that one remembered that, and that one over there remembered that. So 3 different people remembered that particular revelation. When it was all done, Said had, I imagine, a table filled with pieces of revelation. And then he had to do something with it. So he went through and he sorted, and he'd gather together, and he'd say this one and this one are the same. And he'd get rid of the extra copies and keep only one. Sometimes, and this is according to Muslim sources, sometimes he would have 2 and they varied just slightly. And he'd have to decide which one was the authentic one and which one was the misremembered. And he'd keep what he thought was the authentic one and he'd throw the other one in the fire. And so bit by bit he narrowed it down to just a few hundred that make up the Quran today. But now it's a matter of putting them together in some way. There is no way of knowing a chronology. The revelations themselves often don't have a time reference of any sort. Imagine a statement like, for those who are faithful and care for the poor, paradise is prepared for you. But for those who oppress and turn their backs on the poor, hell is prepared for you. There's nothing in there that says when in the course of Muhammad's life that particular revelation came. So Said had to try something different. He went through and he found association words, the word cow, and he put, if the word cow was in this one, and in this one he put those together. If the name Maryam, that's Mary, was in this one, and in this one he put those together. And bit by bit he associated them into clusters of revelation. They didn't always say the same thing. The themes were different from one to another, but those words glued them together. Or an idea that he saw in 2 particular revelations would glue them together. And then bit by bit he began to make piles. The Quran consists of 114 chapters. The opening chapter, it's called a surah in Arabic. The opening chapter is a prayer that sets up the rest of it. And then the remaining 113 of the 114 chapters are collections of these particular revelations. That number is important, by the way, because 114 is also the number of sayings in the Gospel of Thomas. We'll talk more about Muhammad's experience with the outside community in just a little bit. But for now, understand that he knew Christianity, but the kind of Christianity he knew was Gnostic Christianity, and their text had 114 sayings. So it seems that Said might have known this and used that number 114 as his governing principle for creating their own scripture. No one knows that. At any rate, he gathers them together and he ends up with clusters, some of them with many revelations in them, and some of them with just one or two revelations in them. Then he had to decide what to do with that, and he put the largest collection at the beginning, and the second largest followed that, and the third largest followed that, and all the way down until he got to the end when there were just one or two in each one. And those are very, very small chapters. And so the Quran is set up not chronologically, but associatively. What this does is it allows the Quran to live as a memory device, not as a narrative to be studied the way we're used to reading books. Many people in the Muslim community seek to memorize the Quran, to memorize each and every one of these hundreds of pieces of revelation. And they become walking, talking hypertext for the tradition. So that someone could say, do you remember a surah about Jesus? And he'd be able to repeat one. And yes, Jesus is very prominent in the Quran. And then they might mention his mother, Maryam, the Virgin. And they'd say, do you know another one about the Virgin? And they have one right there in their memory. And so the Quran, it isn't about narrative. It's about association, a constant association that's used in prayer and in proclamation. Hence, we have a Quran. Now, it was all sewn together, written down into a book then. Those 114 piles put into a format between two covers. That original Quran may exist today, the one Sayyid put together. If so, it might be the one that's down in Sana'a, Yemen. Well, it was in Sana'a, Yemen, in a mosque down there. It was very famous. It could have been the original Uthman's Quran, but with the civil war in Yemen, it has disappeared. We're hoping that's just temporary. After that moment, every Quran produced had to be identical to that particular one, or it was considered a failure and either corrected or destroyed. So that the Quran has been under scrutiny for its accuracy for the last 1400 years. Let's move to the next part.